It's Sidney Crosby's 37th birthday. You might be wondering what we're going to do about that on an Oilers podcast, but just you wait and see.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. So on today's show, we're going to use Sidney Crosby's 37th birthday as the framing device for a conversation. We're going to talk about greatness in hockey. We're going to talk about the similarities between Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid, the teams that drafted them, how their organizations have responded to having generational talent. And we are going to end with a conversation about who's going to end up being considered better all time when all is said and done. So let's pull it back. Let's go all the way back. We're talking 2005. The NHL is coming out of a lockout that canceled a full season. You got to remember, the year before that, the headline of the 2004 draft was Alex Ovechkin and Evgeny Malkin. That's a really good draft. The year before that, the Penguins take Marc-Andre Fleury first overall. They take Malkin second overall. Then this year, the Penguins somehow inexplicably end up with the first overall pick. So I'm going to read you the rules for that draft lottery in 2005. So it was a weighted lottery based on playoff appearances in the last 3 seasons and first overall picks in the last 4 drafts. The Penguins had a 1 in 16 chance of picking first overall in that draft because they had picked first overall in the previous 3 years and picked second overall the year before this. They hadn't made the playoffs at any of the 3 years. There were 4 teams that had the same weight to start. 4 other teams that hadn't made the playoffs in that 4 previous year window. And weirdly, the Penguins were the only one of those 4 teams that ended up staying relatively close to the top of the draft. The Rangers, the Blue Jackets, they both ended up picking a little bit later in that first round. But you have to understand the dire straits the Penguins organization was in. Yes, they had drafted Malkin. Yes, they had drafted Marc-Andre Fleury. But Malkin wasn't coming over till 2006, 2007. And Marc-Andre Fleury's just one guy on a team that had been bottom dwellers in their division for an extended period of time, that had really failed to replace Jaromir Jagr after trading him to the Capitals. They weren't able to really transition away from the core of the team that was so good in the 90s around Jagr and Lemieux and Paul Coffey to a new iteration. They weren't able to transition smoothly. And instead, the Penguins really bottomed out. I mean, I'm pretty sure most people in the hockey community are well aware that there was genuine conversation about the Penguins moving to Kansas City, Missouri in 2005 because of how poor attendance was, because of how poor the franchise was running, how desperate the franchise was for money. And instead, they pull this draft lottery out of their butt. They draft somebody in Crosby who's probably going to end up, when all is said and done, one of the 4 or 5 best players to ever play the sport. Don't worry, we're going to talk about that later. But when you have the opportunity to draft that next guy, and hockey's a little bit different than the other sports in that archetype of the savior, the next guy, it's a little bit more tangible. It's a little bit more real in hockey than it is in the other sports, because you got to think about it. In football, that quarterback who goes first overall, whether it's Andrew Luck or it's Trevor Lawrence or it's Caleb Williams, for the most part, those guys have good NFL careers. You know, you could go back, Carson Palmer. Guys who get picked in that slot generally have solid NFL careers, but they're not on this level. You know, you can look at basketball and LeBron is the extreme outlier where he was supposed to be the next guy up and he was that next guy. And then I can think about my childhood where Andrew Wiggins and Ben Simmons, a lot of guys that were picked first overall in that savior archetype who had incredible college careers, incredible highlights, explosiveness, everything you would want. and then ended up being rotation players in the case of Wiggins, or in the case of Simmons, somebody who clearly doesn't like basketball all that much. But in hockey, that first overall, that chosen one archetype, it's real. You can look back in the history of the league just over the last 10 to 15 years. And even though a lot of teams didn't end up with McDavid, Austin Matthews is still pretty close. Nathan McKinnon is still pretty close. That translation of first overall to superstar hits at a higher rate than hockey, anecdotally. I need to go and do some analysis. I need to go do some studying of does the first overall pick in the given sport hit their ceiling? And it feels like, at least in hockey, they do. You can look at Connor Bedard, the most recent one. You can look at Rasmus Dahlin. There are examples of, even when they don't hit at that superstar, that all best player in the world level, Rasmus Dahlin is going to be, a fringe Norris guy basically his entire NHL career going forward. You can look at it a lot of different ways. And the other thing, you have to understand, when we are in a different ecosystem of hockey now. The Coyotes are an extreme case where it took, I don't want to call it criminal, but it took active negligence for Gary Bettman to intercept that situation and say, this isn't going to work. We need to move this franchise. 15, 20 years ago, it was a lot more feasible for a franchise to be so dire financially that relocation was truly on the table without there being anything nefarious going on. But you think about it in relation to where the Oilers were, where they had picked first overall a couple times. I'll read it out real quick. They picked 6th, 22nd, 10th, 1st, 7th, 3rd, 1st, and the years up to the Connor McDavid draft. And then they still took a while to get going. We've talked a lot this summer about how the Oilers got out of that long lull. They got out of that dark period where they went 9 years without making the playoffs. They've consistently made it to the postseason now for the better part of a half decade. They are starting to finally rack up playoff series wins, which generally correlate with eventual success. And the Oilers, of course, we all know, were not the favorites to pick first overall that year. That was Toronto. And they had an 11.5% chance of picking first overall in the McDavid draft. And two of the most dominant junior hockey players ever. McDavid put up 188 points in 166 games over 3 years in Erie in the OHL. Did not win the Memorial Cup. They went to the conference final once. They lost in the final another year, and they didn't make the playoffs his first year in the OHL. Crosby, just stupid. 303 points in 121 games. Of course, the QMJHL, a lot higher scoring than the OHL, different environmental factors. So yes, those numbers are absolutely insane, but they are absolutely insane. But you do have to understand the context of the different leagues and what that means. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about that savior narrative, that please help our franchise get us out of this abyss, and why in hockey it's just a little bit different than the other sports, coming up next. We're all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search. Match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your hiring and matching platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality candidates compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Indeed leverages over 140 million unique qualifications and preferences every day. Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from those preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL, each and every day with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. One of the things I truly love about sports, the moments of summation where somebody on the long, winding, arduous road finally gets where they've been trying to get. The hockey world, Ray Bourque is probably the most famous one of the long, tortured player who went a really long time, had to get traded to a better team from the Bruins, get traded to the Avalanche from the Bruins to get over that mountain. But there are other examples of this. You think about right now, the Summer Olympics are going on, and the journey these respective athletes have to go on to get where they're trying to go. Where a lot of these athletes are pretty young, they're in their late teens, early 20s. A few are in their 30s, a few are in their 40s. But for the most part, these are people who have dedicated the majority of their life to getting to a single moment, a single race, a single competition, a single game. And when you put the stakes down like that of, I have spent my entire life to get to this moment, and then you go and deliver. You think about the high jumper from Sweden who broke his own world record. You think about the guy doing the long jump who broke his own record. That stuff. You think about the pole vaulter from Sweden as well. You think about how much goes into getting to those moments. And in the hockey landscape, we can put a perspective on that. A lot of these players, they get to 14, 15 years old, and they are on the radar of NHL franchises. They are on the radar of these CHL teams, and they get drafted by an OHL team, a WHL, a QMJHL. They get drafted by a junior hockey team, and they go live with a billet family as a teenager. They are already microdosing what it's like to be a professional athlete as a teenager. You think about your maturity level at 14, 15, 16 years old, where you were in high school trying to stay awake, and the peak of your day was going to gym class to play like soccer or play team handball. And these are guys who have chosen a path that not a lot of guys can walk. And you think about it in the context of talent. And talent is finite. I know a lot of people will say, well, everybody has a talent. And that's true. Everybody is decent at something. Everybody is good at one thing or another. But there is a quantifiable amount of greatness within a specific domain. And that's what makes the best, that they have more of that greatness. It feels more tangible when you watch them. And when it comes to Connor, when it comes to Sid, that greatness is abound. You watch Connor on a nightly basis, week in, week out, whether it's the most simple of things, just a regroup in his own zone, building up speed, and then just dishing it off, not even driving the net, just dishing it off. You think about the way Sid has recognized, hey, I could probably put up 115, 120 points a season if I wanted to, but my team needs me to be an elite two-way center. My team needs me that when I am out there, the game is in my hands. I am controlling every aspect of this game, no matter which end of the rink we are in. I am going to use my superior body positioning. I'm going to use my hockey instincts to outwork you. I can outplay you, but sometimes, and it's something that does impress me. And you can think about this with a lot of players who've had long primes, or frankly, just never came out of their primes. You look at LeBron, you look at Sid, where they have reinvented themselves over the course of their careers because they've recognized, well, I can still do this at a very high level, but if I focus on facilitating in LeBron's case, or if I focus on defense in Sid's case, I can be a better teammate. I can do more to help my team win. And that's really where we start to get into that rarefied air. And I wrote this a few years ago. I wrote this right after Kobe Bryant died, actually. The thing that really stuck out to me about these maniacal competitors, the people like Kobe Bryant, the people like Tom Brady, the people like LeBron, like Sidney Crosby, like Connor McDavid, they have the talent and they are constantly working on getting better. It is one thing to be very good at something. It is another thing to recognize that, hey, I am this good at this. I can't waste this. And I think that's why we admire those type of maniacal competitors. I think that's what stuck with people the most about The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan Netflix documentary, the 30 for 30, not even 30 for 30, the ESPN documentary, not Netflix. I don't know why I went to Netflix in my head there. The ESPN documentary about Michael Jordan, why The Last Dance resonated with people was they look at Michael Jordan's natural talent and say he's already the best. But that wasn't enough. He wanted to be the best, and he was so maniacal, so fanatical about being the best. He was a miserable teammate. He was starting fights. He was punching people in the face because he demanded that level of expectation. He demanded that level of greatness from them too. And there's a part of all of us that thinks, if I had the talent, if I had that natural God-given ability, I would be like that. I would not let that go to waste. Instead of sitting at a desk all day, filling out spreadsheets or teaching or being a cop or whatever you do for your job, I would be the most maniacal competitor imaginable if I had that natural ability. And when it comes to guys like Sid, when it comes to guys like Connor, it jumps out because there's no shenanigans. I am all about hockey. I have some causes I care about. There's some charity work I do, but I am always about hockey. And something I think about a lot when we talk about that burden of greatness, that expectation that you are going to save a team. I talked about this leading up to the Stanley Cup final, that when McDavid was really young, I want to say he was maybe 5 or 6 years old, he asked his parents for help writing a letter to Sidney Crosby, who was like 15 or 16 at the time. And it really struck me. And McDavid wanted to ask Crosby how he deals with pressure. Connor McDavid was in elementary school, and he already was feeling, okay, I want to be like Sidney Crosby. I need to be like Sidney Crosby. How does Sidney Crosby handle that? And that sounds insane. And frankly, it is. Why a child in elementary school is thinking, well, if he's going to get to the NHL and I want to get to the NHL, I'm already feeling the pressure of needing to get to the NHL as a child, a literal child, somebody 5-6 years of existence on the earth, maybe 3 years of conscious memory, already feeling the pressure of, well, I want to be great. How do I be great? Well, Sidney Crosby's great. How can I be like him? And that's really the ethos of this episode, this idea that when Connor McDavid was a child, he said, I want to be like Sidney Crosby, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get there. And he's there. He is right there. And the next segment, we're going to talk about it. We're going to pit them head to head and see where we come out after this break. It's summer. That means barbecues, the beach, hot dogs, baseball, and concerts. I am going to see Action Bronson tomorrow. I went to Green Day on Monday. That was very fun. But the only place I buy tickets to go to concerts, to go to baseball games, is from our friends over at GameTime, with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. Things like zone deals, where you choose a section and let GameTime choose the seats. All-in pricing, where they show you the total price up front with no surprise fees at checkouts. Seat views, where you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or GameTime will credit you 110% of the difference. And GameTime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Lowest last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hello, everyone, and thank you to everybody who is hanging out on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Oilers in the dog days of summer. So, yes, we are going to indulge this conversation. I understand this is the hockey equivalent of doing LeBron versus Jordan if Jordan was still in the game. It could be like LeBron Kobe was in the early 2010s when I was in high school and college. You can draw whatever comparisons. If you want to do, Giannis versus Embiid, if you want to do, I don't know, Anthony Edwards and Jason Tatum, whatever tickles your fancy as far as comparisons. But I think it matters what you care about. I think accomplishments-wise, it's Crosby. I think Sidney Crosby, as we sit here, has the better resume. Crosby, he's got 3 Stanley Cups. He's a 2-time Art Ross winner. He's a 3-time Ted Lindsay. He's a 2-time Rocket Richard. a 2-time Conn Smythe, a 2-time All-Star, a 2-time Hart Trophy winner, an 8-time playoff All-Star, not the All-Star game like in February, after the playoffs when they picked the All-Star roster. He was the 2009-10 Mark Messier Leadership Award winner. He was on the NHL 100th anniversary team. He has 2 Olympic gold medals, the one in 2010 and the one in 2014. Connor McDavid's resume, he's got 4 Ted Lindsays. He's got a Conn Smythe for this past season, only the 3rd player ever to win the Conn Smythe as the losing team on the losing team in the Cup final. He's won the Art Ross 5 times. He's won the Hart Trophy 3 times, and he's won the Rocket Richard once. He's a 7-time All-Star. Accomplishments-wise, Crosby has more. The Cups, the gold medals, the team accomplishments matter a lot when we're talking about resume. Of course, Sidney Crosby has been in the NHL a lot longer. Sidney Crosby's 37 years old. McDavid's going into his 10th NHL season this upcoming year. So I think people need to take a deep breath and understand, hey, Connor's got a lot of time. I imagine he's going to at least get a couple of Olympic things, whether it's gold or silvers. I imagine eventually, maybe, he will get a Stanley Cup as well. If they win a Stanley Cup, he's probably the best player on that team and probably gets the Conn Smythe as well. So accomplishments-wise, McDavid is not there yet. McDavid is going to need to get those team accomplishments because those team accomplishments, they matter when we're doing the ledgers, when we're comparing resumes. Because I think if we're talking about physical talent, McDavid is more physically talented than Sidney Crosby. He's more explosive. He's more dynamic. This is kind of the same type of deal as far as arguing Gretzky versus Lemieux. There are a lot of old heads who will argue Mario Lemieux was more explosive, more dynamic. And even though Gretzky's got the better resume and the better stats, because he was more Lemieux was more physically talented as opposed to needing to think the game so well like Gretzky, you can make an argument he's the better player. I think right now, as we sit, McDavid is unequivocally the best player in the world. I think McDavid has been the best player in the world probably since 2017 or 18 or so. But you keep racking those up. And as the NHL redefines itself, as the style of play, as the environmental conditions evolve into a more offense-forward mindset, it's not unreasonable to think Connor McDavid can continue to record 120, 130-point seasons with relatively ease. He's going into his age 28 season. The most points he's ever had in a season is 153, and that was last year, last season, 2022, 2023. So if he keeps rattling off 120, 130-point seasons, he mixes in some 150-point outliers. It is highly unlikely that he catches Wayne Gretzky for points. He probably doesn't catch Wayne Gretzky for goals. Can he catch Sidney Crosby? Yeah. I think we also have to acknowledge that Sidney Crosby lost a good chunk of the middle part of his career, his early prime, to injuries and a lockout. A lockout and COVID cost Sidney Crosby a season and a half of games he could have accumulated stats in. He missed quite a few games in the early 2010s, 41 games in 2010-11, 22 games in 11-12. He doesn't really play a full season from ages 23 to 26 because even 12-13, he was healthy. He played 36 of 43 games. He's still 43 games, not 82, and he's missed games here and there. But for the most part, you got to wonder what could have been. You could have wondered if Crosby could have sniffed 2,000 points. And if he had stayed healthy, not outside chance. I mean, could Sidney Crosby still get to 2,000 points? He sits at 1,596 points right now at 37 years old. He's averaged about 85 points over the last 3 seasons. It would take 7 years. I don't think Sidney Crosby's playing another 7 or 8 seasons to get to that 2,000 point marker. I think Sid is comfortably, at worst, the 5th best player of all time. I think confidently I'm putting Gretzky and Mario Lemieux ahead of him. And then it depends how you feel about Gordie Howe and Bobby Orr. Personally, I would take Sidney Crosby over Gordie Howe and Bobby Orr, but I understand that there are people who are going to disagree with that, and that's okay. That's the point of having discussions. We want to hear each other out. We want to think things out. But I think at worst, he is the 5th best player ever. As we sit right now, Connor McDavid at 27 years old, he is unequivocally a first ballot Hall of Famer. I think he's unequivocally the best player of his era. I do think he needs more accomplishments. I do think if he continues to put up points the way he has, if he continues to be on quality teams, he's going to get into this conversation. I think as far as physical talent, I think you can make a real argument he's in that conversation for most talented player of all time. Most talented and best are not the same thing. I do want to delineate that. I do think it's important to make the distinction because accomplishments and physical talent, you could argue, well, who's got more accomplishments, Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes? Well, Tom Brady. Who's more physically talented? Probably Patrick Mahomes. That's the conversation we're having here. I think Crosby is very close and similar to Tom Brady in that respect of not the most physically talented guy, but the smartest guy and talented. So those two things in conjunction with each other make him as good as he's been for as long as he's been. But right now, Crosby is all time ahead of McDavid. Right now, this moment, McDavid is a better hockey player. Can McDavid eventually pass Crosby? Yes. He's going to need more stuff, though. He's going to need some gold medals. He's going to need some Stanley Cups. Those are not impossible to do. If the NHL guys start going to the Olympics regularly again every 4 years, there's a good chance he can come away with at least a silver medal in 2026. He'll only be 29, 30 years old at that point, McDavid. He should be able to get at least 2 full Olympic cycles close to his peak. He has 2 gold medals. They get a cup in there. If he gets 2 gold medals and a Stanley Cup and continues to play at this level for the rest of his prime and then his decline into his early 30s, I think McDavid can end up right there with Crosby where, 4th or 5th best player ever. I really do think that. And I'm very excited to see what happens. It's very fun how connected these two guys are. McDavid has already, and McKinnon, frankly, have already said, yeah, I want to play with Sid. I don't mind. I'll play the wing. Why would I make Crosby play the wing? I really admire the understanding those guys have. There are not a lot of people in the world who can understand that type of feeling of that expectation. And those two are 2 of them. And I imagine there is an understanding about that. And that's what makes them so competitive. And it's what makes them so great. I am very excited for the return of international NHL players participating in best on best international hockey because it's awesome. It is the best spectacle and it's incredible hockey. But that'll do it for today's episode. So if you could please be so kind, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple or Spotify, please, please, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. Who do you think ends up better all time when both players are retired? Connor McDavid or Sidney Crosby? Before we get out of here, thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. Now go check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local flavor. You can find the link to Locked On NHL in the description, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.